Hello, everybody. In this module, we're going to be looking at a ballet by Beethoven called The Creatures of Prometheus. And to understand the significance of this ballet and the story of Prometheus, we have to look at the underlying philosophies of the times. And this has a lot of importance because modern scholars think that these philosophies led to different governments. There's a lot of thought that Enlightenment philosophy became democracy, and that Romantic ideology became fascism and communism and other totalitarian governments. And the world is rarely that simple, and so I don't think we can say for sure that those things are true. But we're going to look at Romantic and Enlightenment kind of art and see if we can get the ideas that underlie this art and understand perhaps how society was shaped by these ideas, or at least how these ideas, which must be in society to be in the art, later became important forms of government. So, what are these two ideas? Well, Enlightenment. The Enlightenment began 100 years earlier in France, and it's the idea that the rational mind is where the power is, rational thought. So, you have some of these philosophers who are atheists, like Voltaire, and they just think we're just looking at the world that we can see and be rational. We have others who are devoutly religious, like Descartes. Now, you know Descartes for a couple of reasons. If you've ever taken a math course, you know the x and the y axis. Those are called Cartesian coordinates. They're named after Descartes. He's a mathematician, and he invented this idea of coordinates. So all of that suffering you did in school with Cartesian coordinates, from Descartes. He's famous for saying, "I think, therefore I am." Now, why did he say that? He's actually trying to prove the existence of God. He says, "What do I know? I don't know anything. Well, I know some things. I know I'm thinking, and therefore I know that I exist." And from there, he says, if I exist, how did I get here? And he eventually leads to a proof of the existence of God using rational mind. Many of us would think that the definition of God has to come out of faith, but in the Enlightenment, it was about rationality. So in the art world, we see Enlightenment thought in terms of form. So if you go to architecture, if you see a beautifully structured building, like the Parthenon, that's a classical building, or the White House, that's a modern classic style building, an Enlightenment building, you see these beautiful structures. Now, we talk about form. What do we mean? Well, form is something like this. If you've ever taken a photography class, you know that if you put the subject of your photograph dead center, it's a snapshot. It doesn't look very interesting. I mean, the person's right there, but the eye doesn't want to go to the center of a picture. Instead, if you want it to look like an art picture, use the rule of thirds. If you divide the picture in thirds, the third that's on the side, that's on the right side of the viewer, that's where the eye naturally goes. Actually, a little bit before the third, but doesn't matter, very close to the third on the right side. And then the second most powerful place is a little bit around the third on the left side of the viewer. And if you put people there, it gives a structure that's very agreeable, that makes you want to look at it. That's true of architecture. For example, if you have a building that's got a wall and then above the building is a gable, if the gable peak, if you go, is if that's the whole building from the ground to the gable peak, and the wall to beginning of the gable is 2/3 and then 1/3 to the gable, the building looks very good to us. If instead you've got a very thin little thing and the gable's way up here, it looks weird. We like to see things structured in particular ways. Well, in music, we don't structure space, we structure time. So we think that, let's say we have a bunch of melodies, and then we play with those melodies, and then we bring the melodies back. We're going to want to bring them back somewhere around 2/3 of the way into the piece. Then the piece seems to have a feeling of order. Whereas if you bring them back in the last 10 seconds, or a third of the way into the piece, then just repeat them over and over, the piece feels out of balance. It doesn't feel right. And so the classical era, and we say classical era of music, that's this era from 1750 to maybe 1820. This is the era when the Enlightenment thought was dominating, and people looking back at ancient Greece, where these proportions were used all the time. So we call it the classical era, referring to Greece. This era of classical music, as opposed to all of classical music, but this particular era, where composers like Mozart in the early days of Beethoven, they they invented all kinds of forms to try and create a structure where time was ordered in a way that was very comfortable and pleasant for us. We're going to have to learn some of those forms to understand what Beethoven was all about. That's the Enlightenment thought. Now, at the same time, or maybe a little bit later, there gets a reaction called Romantic ideology. And Romantic ideology is all about emotion. It's it's not about rational thought. It's about emotional thought. It's about passion, and it's not built on society. Democracy was an idea of the Enlightenment. Everybody's created equally, so everyone should have an equal say in government. Why is a king more powerful than a peasant? That's Enlightenment thought. And so a lot of social structure, a lot of idea of how everyone should get together, that's Enlightenment thought. Romantic thought is about the individual, and it's about passion. There was a real thought in romantic ideology that love was the way to experience God. And they weren't talking about love in a sort of a generic sense. They were talking about sexual love. And they even thought, some of them, that the body got in the way, and it was only through death that you actually were able to experience this. So we get a lot of stories of death and love, and death and suicide combined. Sort of the Romeo and Juliet kind of stories. We see it in Wagner operas like Tristan and Isolde, where they fall, but they don't even die. They fall transfigured. That is, sort of transported to a divine realm. Uh, so the romantic ideology, it's based on the individual. It's based on emotion, oftentimes emotion that is extreme, oftentimes emotion that leads to suicide. The emotions are often built on love, which is almost deified in the Romantic era. And so the Romantic era is this era of passion and the powerful individual. We see that really in Germany, and we're going to see it in one of the early works of Goethe, this poet we're going to read, because although he is a classicist and a romantic, his most famous work is a romantic work. Beethoven is a classicist and a romantic, but a lot of his early popular works are classical, his late works more romantic. So we're going to investigate both of these things, but we're going to start with a ballet by Beethoven called The Creatures of Prometheus. So I'm going to come back, talk about ballet in a little while, but in the meantime, there's some assignments for you about getting to know the Prometheus myth, and then we're going to talk about ballet, see a couple ballets, read a little bit about Beethoven, and then finally, we are then going to listen to this music, the overture and the finale, and we're going to see if we can understand what Beethoven's trying to tell us in his great and only ballet, The Creatures of Prometheus.